Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Ashern Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. When my brother and I were younger, we weren't exactly the best kids. Looking back now, we made plenty of bad decisions, and one of the worst habits we had was shoplifting. At the time, we convinced ourselves it wasn't a big deal. We were young, immature, and never really thought about the consequences. We treated it like a game instead of recognizing how wrong it actually was. There was one particular day that completely changed our plans. Whether it was just a strange coincidence or something I'll never be able to explain, it's a memory that has stayed with both of us ever since. At the time, we were living in El Paso, Texas. If you've ever been there, you know the landscape is mostly dry desert, rocky hills, and open stretches of land. It's not the kind of place where you'd expect to see large, wild animals wandering around, especially wolves. My brother and I had decided we were going to walk to a nearby grocery store. Like we had done many times before, we planned to take a shortcut through a large concrete drainage ditch. It wasn't unusual for kids in the area to walk through it because it was faster than following the regular streets. It was the middle of the day. The weather was clear, and there wasn't much going on around us. The drainage ditch was quiet, just the sound of our footsteps echoing off the concrete walls as we talked about whatever teenagers talked about back then. Neither of us had any reason to think the day would be any different from the dozens of other times we'd walked that same route. We were focused on getting to the store. As we continued walking, something happened so suddenly that I barely had time to react. Out of nowhere, a large white animal came charging toward us. For the briefest moment, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Then it became clear. It looked exactly like a wolf, not a dog, not a coyote, a wolf. Its fur was completely white. It moved with incredible speed, covering the distance between us in what felt like a single leap. The animal jumped toward us. I remember instinctively flinching. Everything happened so fast that there wasn't even time to think. Then I blinked. It was gone. Completely gone. There was no animal running away, no sound of paws hitting the concrete, no movement disappearing around a corner. Nothing. 1 second it was there. The next second, the drainage ditch was completely empty. For a moment, neither of us said a word. We simply stood there, trying to understand what had just happened. My first thought was that maybe I'd imagined it. It had happened so quickly that I questioned whether my eyes had somehow played a trick on me. Then I looked at my brother. Before I could even ask, he looked back at me with the same confused expression. Finally, I said something like, "Did you see that?" Without hesitating, he answered, "Yeah, that single word completely changed the situation. If I had been the only one who saw it, I probably would have convinced myself it was nothing more than a strange visual mistake. But my brother had seen it too. He described the same thing, a large white wolf, appearing out of nowhere, jumping toward us, then disappearing just as suddenly. Neither of us could explain it. We looked around the drainage ditch for several minutes. It wasn't a place where a large animal could simply vanish. There were no nearby bushes thick enough to hide in, no buildings, no tunnels close enough for it to disappear into that quickly. The ditch stretched out in both directions, leaving very few places anything that size could hide. Yet there was absolutely nothing there. The entire area was silent. We stood there trying to make sense of it. Maybe it had actually been a dog. Maybe it had turned away before we noticed. Maybe the angle or lighting had fooled us somehow. We came up with one explanation after another, but none of them really fit what we'd both experienced. Eventually, my brother looked at me and said something simple. "Let's just go home." Normally, we would have laughed something like that off. Instead, I immediately agreed. Neither of us argued. Neither of us suggested continuing to the grocery store. Whatever we'd just seen had completely destroyed our confidence. Without another word, we turned around and walked back the way we'd come. Neither of us talked very much during the walk home. Every few seconds, we'd glance behind us. Not because we expected to see the animal again, but because the entire experience had left us feeling uneasy. Once we got home, we didn't go back out that day. The trip to the grocery store was forgotten. Looking back now, I've often wondered whether the strange encounter unintentionally kept us from making another bad decision. We had set out planning to steal from the store. Instead, we turned around and went home without ever getting there. Maybe that was just coincidence. Maybe the experience simply scared us enough to abandon our plans. Either way, it worked. Over the years, my brother and I have talked about that day several times. Every conversation ends the same way. Neither of us can explain what we saw. People have suggested all kinds of possibilities. Some think it may have been a large white dog that disappeared behind part of the drainage system before we realized it. Others think it could have been a trick of perspective or a shared misunderstanding caused by surprise. Those explanations are certainly possible. Memory can also change over time, especially when recalling something that happened many years ago. I recognize that. Still, one detail has always stood out to both of us. We both reacted before saying anything. Neither of us influenced the other's memory in that first moment. I asked if he'd seen it. He immediately said yes. Only afterward did we compare what we'd witnessed. That has always made the experience difficult for me to dismiss completely. I've also heard local stories over the years about unusual sightings in desert areas around the Southwest. Some people connect experiences like ours to old legends or local folklore. Others believe there are perfectly ordinary explanations for every strange encounter. Personally, I don't claim to know which is correct. I only know what happened from my perspective. We were two teenagers walking through a drainage ditch in El Paso on our way to a grocery store. A large white wolf appeared out of nowhere, leaped toward us, and disappeared almost instantly. We both saw it. We both stopped in our tracks. And without saying much to each other, we quietly turned around and went straight home. To this day, I still don't know whether we witnessed something ordinary that happened so quickly our minds couldn't process it correctly, or whether it was simply one of those strange moments that never receives a satisfying explanation. Whatever it was, neither my brother nor I have ever forgotten that walk through the drainage ditch, or the white wolf that seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. In 2017, my father was diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer. It was one of those moments that instantly changes everything. One day, life feels normal, and the next, every conversation revolves around hospital visits, treatments, doctors, and trying to make the most of whatever time you have left together. The diagnosis was devastating for our entire family. Watching someone you love slowly decline is a kind of helplessness that's difficult to describe. You want to believe they'll somehow get better, even when you've been told the outcome isn't going to change. About a month after his diagnosis, he had been staying in the hospital for some time. My routine had become fairly predictable by then. During the day, I'd visit him whenever I could. We'd sit together, talk when he felt up to it, and try to keep things as normal as possible. Some days were better than others. Some days, he barely had enough energy to speak. Every visit ended the same way. Leaving the hospital always felt wrong. You never knew whether the goodbye you were saying would be the last one. One particular night, my girlfriend, my mom, and I were all sitting around the dining room table at home. It was late. really late. I remember looking at the clock at one point and noticing it was around 1:30 in the morning. None of us were in much of a mood to sleep. Cancer has a way of turning nights into long stretches of waiting and worrying. We were simply sitting together, talking quietly about my dad, the hospital, and what the next few days might look like. The house was completely silent. No television, no music, just the three of us around the table. Then something happened that I've never been able to explain. Without any warning, I looked toward the doorway leading into the room. My father walked through it. At least, that's exactly what it looked like to me. He wasn't standing there for just a split second. He actually walked into the room. I could clearly recognize him. There was no doubt in my mind about who I was looking at. I could see his face. I recognized the clothes he was wearing, his posture, the way he moved. Everything looked unmistakably like my dad. At the same time, something about his appearance was completely different. His entire body had a hazy gray quality to it. The best way I've ever been able to describe it is that he looked like he was made of dense fog. Not transparent exactly, just surrounded by a soft gray mist. Despite that, I could still see every detail clearly. The edges of his body remained sharp and well-defined. It wasn't blurry. It wasn't like looking through smoke. It was as though a perfectly recognizable person had somehow been formed out of gray mist. He didn't speak. Not a single word. The entire room remained completely silent. He calmly walked across the room toward my mother first. Then he leaned down and hugged her. I watched the entire thing happen. Next, he walked over to where my girlfriend and I were sitting. He positioned himself between us. Then he placed one hand gently on my girlfriend's shoulder. With his other arm, he reached around me. I remember feeling something at that exact moment. It wasn't pressure the way a physical hug normally feels. Instead, it was a light tingling sensation, almost like gentle static electricity. Not painful, not cold, just a faint electrical feeling exactly where I believed he was touching me. It lasted only while his arm was around me. The strangest part is that I wasn't simply watching this happen silently. As everything unfolded, I started describing it out loud. I remember saying what I was seeing as it happened. I told my mom and my girlfriend that my dad had just walked into the room. I described where he was standing. I told them he was hugging my mom. Then I explained that he'd moved over beside us. I told them he had his hand on my girlfriend's shoulder and his arm around me. They both looked at me with complete confusion. From their perspective, there was nobody there. They couldn't see anything. As I continued talking, they exchanged the kind of look people give each other when they aren't sure how to respond. They clearly thought something was wrong with me. I don't blame them. If our positions had been reversed, I probably would have reacted exactly the same way. The entire experience lasted only a short time. Then, just as quietly as he'd appeared, he was gone. The room looked completely normal again. No dramatic ending, no sound, no flash of light. He simply wasn't there anymore. None of us knew what to say afterward. Eventually, we all went to bed. I kept replaying the experience in my mind. Part of me wondered whether stress and exhaustion had somehow caused me to imagine the entire thing. The previous month had been emotionally draining. Very little sleep, constant worry, hospital visits. It's entirely reasonable to think those circumstances could affect how someone experiences the world. That's what I tried telling myself. The following morning, everything changed. We were awakened by phone calls. The hospital was calling. My father had passed away during the night. Hearing those words immediately brought me back to what I'd experienced only hours earlier. The timing was impossible to ignore. One moment I was trying to convince myself I'd imagined everything. The next, I learned that my father had died sometime during the same night. I don't know the exact time he passed. I've never tried to compare the timeline minute by minute. I only know that the experience happened during the early hours of the morning, and when we woke up, we learned he was gone. I've thought about that night countless times over the years. People have offered many different explanations. Some believe experiences like mine are part of the grieving process. Others suggest the brain can create vivid sensory experiences during periods of intense emotional stress, especially when someone is anticipating the loss of a loved one. Those explanations make sense. They deserve to be considered. At the same time, I can't deny how real the experience felt to me. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't asleep. I was sitting at the dinner table with two other people. I clearly remember describing everything I was seeing as it happened. Neither my mom nor my girlfriend saw anything unusual. From their perspective, I was talking about someone who simply wasn't there. That detail has always stayed with me. If I had experienced it alone in bed during the middle of the night, I probably would have dismissed it as an unusually vivid dream. Instead, I was fully awake, carrying on a conversation, while also watching something I still can't explain. I've never claimed that what I saw was definitely supernatural. I honestly don't know what it was. Maybe it was my mind trying to process the fact that I already knew my father was nearing the end of his life. Maybe grief can create experiences far more vivid than most people realize. Or maybe it was something I'll never be able to explain. All I know is what I experienced. I watched what appeared to be my father quietly walk into the room. I watched him hug my mother. I felt what seemed like a gentle, tingling touch as he stood beside my girlfriend and wrapped an arm around me. I narrated every moment while it happened, even though no one else could see what I was describing. Then, the following morning, we learned that he had passed away during the night. Whether there is a logical explanation or not, that memory has stayed with me ever since. Out of everything I've experienced in my life, nothing has ever felt quite as real, as peaceful, or as impossible to explain as those few silent moments around the dining room table before we learned that my father was gone. My grandfather passed away in 2011, and losing him was one of the hardest experiences my family had ever gone through. His death wasn't sudden, but it also wasn't something any of us were truly prepared for. Everything started when he suffered a stroke while he was driving. From what we were told, he lost control of the vehicle, and his car crashed into a concrete embankment. The accident itself was serious, but it was the stroke that caused everything to unfold the way it did. He survived the crash and was rushed to the hospital. For the next month, our lives revolved around the intensive care unit. Every day felt almost identical. Hospital visits, waiting rooms, quiet conversations with doctors, trying to read expressions on nurses' faces before they even spoke. Family members came and went at different times, all hoping for some kind of improvement. Some days seemed slightly more hopeful than others. Other days reminded us just how serious his condition really was. The ICU became strangely familiar. It was a place none of us wanted to be, yet somewhere we found ourselves spending hour after hour. Eventually, the doctors explained that there was nothing more they could realistically do. The decision was made to bring him home and begin hospice care. As difficult as that conversation was, there was also some comfort in knowing he would be surrounded by family instead of hospital equipment during his final days. Those last days were quiet. Family members spent as much time with him as possible. People shared stories. Some cried openly. Others simply sat beside him in silence. There isn't really a right way to say goodbye to someone you've loved your entire life. Everyone handles it differently. Not long afterward, my grandfather passed away. The house felt different almost immediately. It's difficult to explain unless you've experienced it yourself. Nothing physically changes, but somehow everything feels different. The rooms seem quieter. Conversations become softer. Even ordinary routines suddenly feel unfamiliar because one important person is no longer there. In the days after his passing, family members continued gathering together. People checked on one another. Meals were shared. Stories about my grandfather kept coming up naturally in conversation. One afternoon, I was sitting outside with my mom and my aunt. We had gathered around a table in the yard, enjoying some fresh air after spending so much time indoors. The conversation wasn't especially emotional at that moment. We were simply sitting together. I remember lowering my head for a moment while everyone else continued talking. I don't even remember exactly what I was looking at. Maybe my hands, maybe the table. It was just one of those quiet pauses where your mind drifts. Then I suddenly felt something brush firmly against my shoulder. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't the kind of feeling you get from a breeze. It felt exactly like someone walking closely past you and accidentally bumping your shoulder. The contact was strong enough that I reacted immediately. Without even thinking, I became irritated. My first assumption was that my brother had walked behind me on his way to sit in the empty chair nearby. I turned around almost instantly, ready to say something. There was no one there. The chair was still empty. My brother wasn't anywhere near me. For a second, I simply stared, confused. Then I realized something else. The sensation itself had been unusual. It wasn't just the feeling of being bumped. There had been a strange tingling that came with it. The closest comparison I've ever found is touching one of those plasma globe lamps. If you've ever held your hand against the glass while the tiny streams of electricity gather beneath your fingertips, you'll know the feeling I'm talking about. It wasn't painful. It didn't shock me. It was simply a light static sensation that traveled across the spot where I'd felt the contact. That combination has stayed with me ever since. It felt like someone had brushed against my shoulder while carrying a faint electrical charge. I immediately looked around the yard. There was nobody standing behind me. Nobody had walked past. Nothing nearby could have brushed against me. I didn't say much at first because I wasn't entirely sure what had happened. I spent the next several minutes quietly replaying the moment in my head. The feeling had been so convincing that I never questioned whether someone had touched me. The only confusing part was that there hadn't actually been anyone there. Over the years, I've thought about that afternoon many times. There are plenty of ordinary explanations that deserve consideration. Grief affects people in countless ways. During periods of emotional stress, it's not unusual for our minds and bodies to experience things differently. Muscle twitches, heightened awareness, unexpected sensations, and even vivid perceptions can all happen during difficult times. I understand that. I've never claimed that what I experienced was definitely something supernatural. I honestly don't know what caused it. All I know is how real it felt. For one brief moment, I was absolutely convinced someone had brushed firmly against my shoulder. I reacted before I even looked. That's what has always stood out to me. It wasn't an idea that gradually formed afterward. The sensation came first. My reaction came naturally. Only afterward did I discover there was nobody there. Whether it was simply my brain processing grief in an unusual way, or something I'll never fully understand, I can't say. What I can say is that I've never forgotten the feeling. Even now, years later, I can still remember exactly how that static-like sensation traveled across my shoulder. It happened only once. I've never experienced it again. Maybe it was nothing more than an ordinary physical sensation that happened during an emotionally difficult time. Maybe the timing made it feel more meaningful than it actually was. Or maybe it was simply one of those moments that stays with you, because no explanation ever feels completely satisfying. Whatever the reason, That brief touch remains one of the most vivid memories I have from the days after my grandfather passed away. It's a small moment compared to everything else that happened during that difficult time, but it's also the one memory that has never faded. Whenever I think about my grandfather now, I remember many wonderful things about him. But I also remember sitting quietly outside with my mom and aunt, feeling someone brush firmly against my shoulder, turning around expecting to see my brother, and finding only an empty chair and a lingering sensation that felt strangely like static electricity. It's still something I can't fully explain, and after all these years, I still occasionally wonder what, if anything, really happened that afternoon. One of the most unsettling nights I've ever experienced happened while camping just outside Wrightwood, California. I've spent plenty of nights outdoors over the years, and I'm usually comfortable sleeping in the wilderness. Strange noises are part of camping. You hear insects, owls, coyotes, rustling leaves, and all kinds of sounds that seem much louder once the sun goes down. Normally, those noises don't bother me. This night was different. A group of about 8 of us had gone camping together, and instead of bringing tents, we decided to cowboy camp. We simply rolled out our sleeping bags under the open sky. It was a beautiful evening. The weather was clear, the stars were incredibly bright, and the air was cool enough to be comfortable without getting cold. There wasn't much wind, and the forest was unusually peaceful. After talking around camp for a while, everyone eventually settled down to sleep. Lying out in the open always feels a little different from sleeping inside a tent. There's nothing between you and the surrounding wilderness. You can see the stars overhead, hear every sound around you, and feel much more connected to your surroundings. That's part of what makes it enjoyable. It's also what makes unexpected noises far more unsettling. Sometime during the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Everything around us was still dark. The camp was quiet. Then I heard it. A strange chirping sound. It wasn't especially loud, but it was unusual enough to get my attention. The noise repeated every few moments. It didn't sound like the birds I was used to hearing. It was sharper, almost mechanical, just different. As I listened, I realized other people in our group were waking up too. One by one, sleepy voices started asking what the sound was. Nobody seemed particularly worried yet. It was more curiosity than concern. One of my friends, still half asleep, groaned and said something like, "I wish that bird would shut up." For a second, nobody replied. I kept listening. The more I heard it, the less convinced I was that it was a bird. I'd spent enough time outdoors to know that not every strange noise in the forest actually comes from birds. Something about this sound reminded me of stories I'd heard about mountain lions. I'd once learned that they can make surprisingly unusual vocalizations, especially at night. The thought crossed my mind almost immediately. I finally answered my friend. "I'm pretty sure that's not a bird." He asked what I thought it was. I remember saying, "I think it might be a mountain lion." The words had barely left my mouth when the entire atmosphere changed. From somewhere just beyond a line of bushes bordering our campsite came an unmistakable scream. It wasn't the chirping anymore. This was loud, deep, wild, a long, drawn-out caterwaul echoed through the darkness. The sound seemed to come from just outside the edge of our camp. Every single person instantly became wide awake. Nobody spoke. Nobody laughed. The playful mood disappeared completely. Even though we couldn't actually see the animal, hearing that sound so close made it impossible to ignore how exposed we really were. Without tents, there was nothing separating us from whatever was standing beyond those bushes. We simply lay there, listening. The silence afterward somehow felt even worse. Every tiny rustle in the surrounding brush suddenly seemed important. Every breeze sounded louder than it had before. My imagination immediately started filling in possibilities. Was it still there? Had it moved? Was it watching us? Or had it already wandered away? None of us knew. Someone quietly whispered that we should stay where we were. That seemed like the smartest decision. Nobody had any interest in wandering around the campsite in the middle of the night after hearing that. Eventually, the conversation faded again, not because anyone relaxed, but because there wasn't much else to say. We simply listened. Every few minutes, someone would shift in their sleeping bag. Otherwise, the camp remained almost perfectly still. As luck would have it, I suddenly realized I needed to use the bathroom, really badly. Under normal circumstances, that wouldn't have been a problem. I'd simply grab a flashlight, walk a safe distance from camp, and come back a few minutes later. That night, there was absolutely no chance I was leaving the group. Not after hearing what sounded very much like a mountain lion only moments earlier. I remember lying there trying to convince myself the feeling would go away. It didn't. Every few minutes I'd consider getting up. Then, I'd remember that scream. That was enough to keep me exactly where I was. I finally decided that no matter how uncomfortable I became, I was staying put until daylight. It seemed like the far wiser choice. The rest of the night felt incredibly long. Sleep came only in short stretches. Every unfamiliar sound pulled my attention right back to the surrounding darkness. I found myself staring into the trees, trying to see beyond the reach of the moonlight, knowing full well that if a mountain lion really had been nearby, I probably wouldn't have seen it anyway. They move quietly. They're incredibly well camouflaged. The idea that one could be just outside the campsite without us knowing exactly where it was made the entire experience even more unsettling. Eventually, the first hints of sunrise began to appear. The darkness slowly faded into gray, and the woods started looking familiar again. As daylight spread across the campsite, the tension that had built throughout the night finally began to disappear. Only then did I finally get up to take care of the bathroom situation I'd been putting off for hours. It was probably one of the easiest decisions I've ever made. Waiting until sunrise felt infinitely smarter than wandering into the darkness while a large predator might still have been nearby. Once everyone was fully awake, we talked about what we'd heard. Some people admitted they'd never realized mountain lions could make sounds like that. Others said they'd been just as convinced it was a bird at first. Looking back, it's almost funny how quickly our confidence disappeared the moment that scream echoed from the bushes. I've camped many times since then. I've heard coyotes, owls, foxes, and plenty of other nighttime wildlife. Most of those sounds don't bother me anymore. But whenever someone mentions mountain lions, my mind immediately goes back to that night outside Wrightwood. I remember the peaceful evening beneath a sky full of stars. I remember waking to that strange chirping noise. I remember my friend wishing the bird would be quiet. I remember saying I thought it sounded like a mountain lion. And I especially remember the instant that eerie caterwaul answered from just beyond the bushes, proving that whatever had been making those strange noises was much closer than any of us wanted it to be. Out of all the nights I've spent camping, that one taught me the most respect for just how wild the outdoors can still be once the sun goes down. One of the most disturbing things I've ever witnessed didn't involve anything supernatural or mysterious. It was something completely real, and that's exactly why it stayed with me for so many years. It happened during what should have been an ordinary day at the beach. The weather was beautiful. The sun was out, families were scattered across the sand, children were building sandcastles, and people were swimming or relaxing under umbrellas. It was the kind of peaceful summer afternoon where everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves. I had gone down to the shoreline because I wanted to cool off. Like a lot of people do at the beach, I wasn't planning on swimming. I just wanted to walk through the shallow water and let the waves wash over my feet. The tide was slowly coming in. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. The waves were gentle, rolling onto the beach one after another, each one reaching a little farther than the last. As I walked closer to the water, something caught my attention. At first, I thought it was a towel, or maybe a pile of clothes lying on the sand. Then I realized it was moving. I looked more carefully. It was a baby, a very young baby. The child was lying alone on the sand, just a short distance from the water. There wasn't anyone sitting nearby. No stroller, no adults watching, no older siblings playing close enough to obviously be looking after the baby. The child looked so young that it couldn't even crawl yet. It simply lay there on the sand by itself. I immediately stopped walking. At first, I assumed the parents had to be close by. Maybe they were only a few feet away. Maybe one of them had turned around for a moment. So I stayed where I was. I looked around in every direction, expecting someone to come rushing over after realizing they'd wandered too far away. Nobody came. Meanwhile, the tide kept moving closer. Each wave reached a little farther up the beach than the one before it. The water wasn't dangerous yet, but it was obvious that it wouldn't stay that way for long. I remember thinking that surely whoever was responsible for the baby would notice within seconds. Still, nobody appeared. The baby remained completely alone. I didn't feel comfortable walking away. Instead, I stood nearby, watching both the child and the approaching water. Several more minutes passed. The tide continued rising. Eventually, the waves reached the area where the baby had been lying. At that point, waiting no longer seemed like an option. I walked over, carefully picked the baby up, and held the child in my arms. The baby didn't seem upset. There wasn't any frantic crying or screaming. That somehow made the situation feel even stranger. I kept scanning the beach in every direction. Surely someone had to be looking for their child by now. I considered walking farther inland, but then another thought crossed my mind. If the parents came back to where they'd left the baby and found the spot empty, they might panic and start searching in the wrong direction. So instead, I stayed roughly where I'd found the child. I figured that would make it easier for whoever was responsible to find us. The tide continued coming in. The water kept rising. Standing there, I watched the waves creep farther up the beach. Eventually, the water reached my ankles. Then higher. Time seemed to move incredibly slowly. I couldn't understand how nobody had noticed their baby was missing. As the minutes passed, the water climbed even farther. Eventually, it was brushing against my knees. I was standing there holding someone else's infant, while the tide continued rolling in, and still no one had come looking. By that point, I was no longer just confused. I was angry. I couldn't imagine how anyone could leave a baby alone for that long, especially with the ocean steadily moving closer. Finally, I saw a couple hurrying toward me from farther up the beach. They weren't running in panic. They simply walked over as though they were returning to pick up something they'd temporarily set down. When they reached me, it became obvious they were the baby's parents. They explained what had happened. When they'd noticed the tide coming in, they'd gathered up all of their belongings and moved everything farther back up the beach so it wouldn't get wet. Their bags, their towels, their chairs, their cooler. Everything in the process, they had somehow left their baby behind. While they were protecting all of their possessions from the incoming water, they'd forgotten the one thing that mattered more than any of it: their own child. I honestly couldn't believe what I was hearing. I handed the baby back to them. I expected panic, relief, shock, something. Instead, their reaction felt strangely casual. They barely thanked me. There wasn't a long conversation, no apology, no visible realization of how close the situation could have become if nobody had happened to walk by. They simply took the baby, put it in their bag, and walked away. I watched them slowly walk back to the beach, their eyes full of concern. and continued on their way as though nothing unusual had happened. I stood there watching them leave, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Even now, years later, I still struggle to understand it. Parents can become distracted. Accidents happen. People make mistakes. I understand all of that. But this wasn't a matter of looking away for a few seconds. The tide had continued rising for long enough that I'd gone from simply watching the baby to eventually picking the child up, then standing there holding them while the water steadily climbed until it was nearly up to my knees. That wasn't a brief lapse in attention. It felt like an incredibly long time. I've replayed that afternoon in my mind countless times. I still remember looking around the beach, expecting someone to suddenly realize what had happened. I remember the growing sense of disbelief with every wave that reached farther up the sand. Most of all, I remember the feeling of holding a baby who was too young to even crawl while wondering where the parents could possibly be. Thankfully, everything ended without anyone being hurt. The baby was safe. That's what matters most. But the experience permanently changed the way I look at crowded public places. Before that day, I assumed someone was always paying attention. Now I know that's not always true. Whenever I visit a beach, a park, or any place where families gather, I find myself noticing children much more than I used to. Not because I'm expecting something terrible to happen, but because I know how quickly a dangerous situation can develop when everyone assumes someone else is watching. Out of all the strange and frightening things people talk about seeing in their lives, this remains one of the most disturbing experiences I've ever had. Not because it involved anything supernatural, not because it was violent, but because for one unforgettable stretch of time, a helpless baby was left completely alone on a beach while the tide slowly rolled in. And if I hadn't happened to be walking toward the water at that exact moment, I still don't like to think about what could have happened next. When my son was a toddler, he went through a phase that completely changed the way I thought about children's imaginations. I've always believed that young kids can invent incredibly detailed stories, so whenever he talked about imaginary friends, I assumed that was exactly what was happening. At first, nothing seemed unusual. He was at the age where pretend play was a normal part of everyday life. He'd have conversations with stuffed animals, make up games, and spend long stretches of time talking to people only he could see. Every parent I knew had stories like that, so I never thought much of it. Then the conversations started becoming stranger. One afternoon, I walked past his bedroom and noticed he was sitting quietly on the floor. He wasn't playing with toys, he wasn't reading. He was simply facing the corner of the room, smiling and talking as though someone was standing there having a conversation with him. At first, I assumed he was pretending. Kids often create imaginary characters, and that's usually a healthy part of growing up. Still, I was curious. I stepped into the room and casually asked who he was talking to. Without hesitation, he answered, "Andy." He said it so naturally that it sounded like he was talking about someone I should already know. I smiled and decided to play along. "Oh yeah? Who's Andy?" He simply pointed toward the corner where nobody was standing. I couldn't see anything, of course. To me, the room was completely empty. Wanting to understand where this imaginary character had come from, I asked another question. "Is Andy your friend?" He nodded. Then, for reasons I still can't explain, another question popped into my head. I don't know why I asked it. Maybe I'd heard similar stories from other parents. Maybe I was just joking around. Either way, I looked at him and asked, "Is Andy alive?" Without missing a beat, my son smiled. Then, in a cheerful little sing-song voice that toddlers often use when they're making up rhymes, he answered, "Not any moo-oo-or." He stretched out the last word almost like he was singing it. The answer caught me completely off guard. I laughed nervously because I honestly didn't know how else to react. Children say strange things all the time. They repeat words they've heard without understanding them. That's what I told myself. I didn't ask any more questions. I simply moved on with the day. But Andy wasn't the only person he talked about. Over the following weeks and months, new names started appearing. Each one seemed just as real to him as the last. One day he casually mentioned someone named Message. At first I thought I'd misunderstood him. I asked him to repeat the name. He clearly said, Message, not Messenger, not a nickname, just Message. Naturally, I asked who Message was. He explained that Message was blue. That was about all the information he offered. He didn't describe him as scary. He didn't seem afraid. Message was simply another person he occasionally talked to. As odd as the name sounded, I still assumed it was nothing more than a child's imagination creating unusual characters. Then another one appeared. This one disturbed me much more. He started talking about someone he called the Cutoff Lady. Even hearing the name for the first time made me uneasy. I asked him who she was. His description was unlike anything I'd expected. He told me she didn't have any arms. She didn't have any legs either. According to him, she floated instead of walking. Again, he described all of this with complete confidence, as though he were explaining the appearance of an ordinary neighbor. Children often invent bizarre imaginary characters, so I tried not to overreact. Still, I couldn't help asking more questions. What does she do? His answer has stayed with me ever since. He calmly explained that the Cutoff Lady would take him flying. According to him, she'd lift him out of the house. Then they'd travel together to another house a few doors away. Finally, she'd bring him back home again. He described it as though it happened regularly. The destination immediately caught my attention. The house he pointed to was 3 doors down from ours. At the time, nobody lived there. It had been condemned. The windows were boarded up. The yard was overgrown. It had been sitting empty for quite a while. Most adults in the neighborhood barely paid attention to it anymore. Yet somehow, my son specifically claimed the Cutoff Lady took him there. I remember trying to figure out where he'd gotten the idea. Maybe he'd overheard adults talking about the abandoned house. Maybe older neighborhood kids had told stories about it. There were plenty of ordinary possibilities. Even so, hearing a toddler calmly describe flying there with an imaginary woman who had no arms or legs was deeply unsettling. Unlike Andy and Message, the Cutoff Lady seemed different. Whenever my son talked about Andy, he sounded relaxed. The same was true for Message. There wasn't any fear in his voice. But conversations about the Cutoff Lady always felt different. He never smiled while talking about her. His tone changed. He seemed uncomfortable. The older he became, the less willing he was to discuss her. Eventually, he stopped mentioning her altogether. Years passed. As he grew older, all of those imaginary conversations disappeared. Andy was never mentioned again. Neither was Message. The Cutoff Lady became something we simply stopped hearing about. One day, years later, I asked him whether he remembered any of those names from when he was little. Most children enjoy hearing funny stories about themselves as toddlers. I expected him to laugh. Instead, he became unusually quiet. He said he didn't want to talk about the Cutoff Lady. I assumed he simply didn't remember much and felt awkward about it. So I didn't push the conversation. Since then, I've occasionally brought up Andy or Message in a light-hearted way. Those names don't seem to bother him. The Cutoff Lady is different. Even now, he doesn't like discussing her. I've never forced the issue. Children create incredibly vivid imaginary worlds. Psychologists have long recognized imaginary companions as a completely normal part of childhood development. Some children invent detailed characters with names, personalities, and elaborate adventures that feel completely real to them. That's probably the simplest explanation. I fully accept that possibility. At the same time, it's hard to forget how naturally he described everything. There was never any hesitation, no obvious signs that he was making up a story on the spot. He answered every question as though he were describing people he'd actually met. Looking back now, I don't claim that anything supernatural happened. I honestly have no idea. Maybe my son simply had an extraordinary imagination. Maybe all of those characters were products of a creative toddler's mind. Or maybe some childhood experiences simply remain impossible for adults to fully understand, because we no longer see the world the way young children do. Whatever the explanation may be, I still remember walking into his room and finding him happily chatting with someone standing in an empty corner. I remember asking who he was talking to. I remember hearing the name, Andy, and I'll never forget the cheerful little voice that answered my completely unexpected question by singing. Not any moo-oo-or. As strange as that moment was, it was only the beginning. Because Andy disappeared, message came and went, but the cutoff lady was the only one who ever made my son genuinely uncomfortable. Even today, after all these years, that's still the one name he refuses to talk about. One of the strangest experiences I've ever had happened when my oldest daughter was still a baby. Even after all these years, I still remember every detail because it caught me completely off guard. At the time, she wasn't even a year old. Like most babies her age, bedtime could be unpredictable. Some nights she'd fall asleep almost immediately, while other nights she'd fight sleep with everything she had. This happened during one of those difficult nights. I'd gone through our usual bedtime routine. She'd been fed, changed, and put to bed, but for whatever reason, she simply refused to settle down. She cried every time I tried to lay her in her crib. No matter what I did, nothing seemed to comfort her. Eventually, I decided to stop trying for a little while. Instead of staying upstairs, I picked her up and carried her downstairs to the living room, hoping a change of scenery might calm her enough to get sleepy again. The house was quiet. It was late enough that everyone else had already gone to bed. The lights downstairs were dim, creating that peaceful nighttime atmosphere every house seems to have after midnight. I sat down on the sofa with my daughter on my lap. She was facing me while I faced toward the television, which wasn't turned on. Behind me was the staircase leading upstairs. From where I was sitting, I couldn't see the stairs without turning around, but my daughter was looking directly toward them over my shoulder. I started talking softly to her. Sometimes hearing a familiar voice was enough to settle her. I rocked her gently while trying to distract her from whatever had been upsetting her. At first, nothing changed. She continued crying. She fussed, squirmed, and generally acted exactly the way overtired babies often do. She looked frustrated and uncomfortable. Then, without any warning at all, everything changed. She suddenly stopped crying. Completely, her expression transformed in an instant. Instead of looking upset, she broke into a huge smile. It wasn't just a small smile either. She looked genuinely excited. Then she happily said, "Hi." Now, hearing her say hello wasn't unusual. She was an incredibly social baby. She loved people. Whenever someone entered a room, she'd often smile, wave, or greet them if they caught her attention. In fact, one of the easiest ways to stop her from crying was for another person to walk into the room. She'd immediately become fascinated by them. So when she suddenly smiled and said hello while looking over my shoulder, I didn't think anything was strange. My first thought was simple. My husband must have come downstairs. I assumed he'd heard her crying and decided to check on us. Without even turning around immediately, I smiled, because I expected to see him standing somewhere near the bottom of the staircase. Meanwhile, my daughter became even happier. She started waving enthusiastically. Both of her little hands moved excitedly toward whatever she was looking at behind me. She giggled. She laughed. It was exactly how she'd react whenever someone she liked came into view. Her entire mood had changed within seconds. Still smiling, I finally turned around. Nobody was there. The staircase was completely empty. The hallway was empty. There wasn't anyone standing nearby. For a moment, I assumed my husband had already gone back upstairs. Maybe I'd just missed him, so I called out for him. No answer. A few moments later, I quietly walked upstairs while carrying my daughter. My husband was exactly where I'd left him, fast asleep. He hadn't come downstairs. In fact, judging by how deeply he was sleeping, he probably hadn't even heard our daughter crying. That realization stopped me in my tracks. If he hadn't been downstairs, who had she been looking at? I went back over everything in my head. Maybe she'd simply been staring into empty space. Babies often focus on random things adults don't notice. Maybe there had been a shadow on the wall. Maybe headlights from a passing car had briefly reflected through a window. Maybe something entirely ordinary had caught her attention. I tried to come up with a reasonable explanation. The only problem was her reaction. She hadn't simply looked in that direction. She'd behaved exactly as she always did when greeting a real person. She smiled. She said hello. She waved repeatedly. She laughed as though someone were smiling back at her. Most importantly, she kept her attention fixed on one specific spot behind me. Not all around the room, just one location. The entire interaction lasted long enough for me to become convinced someone had actually entered the room. That's why I expected to find my husband standing there. After realizing nobody was downstairs, I didn't mention it again that night. There wasn't really anything else to say. Eventually, I got my daughter settled back into bed, and she fell asleep without any further problems. Life continued as normal. Still, I found myself thinking about that evening more often than I expected. Parents hear countless stories about babies smiling at empty corners or seemingly interacting with people adults can't see. I'd always assumed those stories had perfectly ordinary explanations. Babies are constantly noticing sounds, lights, movements, and details that adults overlook. Their imaginations also develop in fascinating ways as they grow. I still believe that's entirely possible. Maybe she noticed something I couldn't see because I wasn't facing the same direction. Maybe there was a reflection. Maybe there was some tiny visual detail that only captured her attention. Those explanations make sense. At the same time, it's difficult to ignore how naturally she behaved. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't confused. She acted exactly as though someone familiar had quietly walked into the room to say hello. Looking back now, I don't claim that anything supernatural happened. I honestly don't know. I simply know what I witnessed. One moment I was trying unsuccessfully to calm a crying baby. The next, she instantly became cheerful after apparently seeing someone standing behind me. I expected to turn around and find my husband. Instead, the room was completely empty, while my daughter continued smiling and waving toward the staircase. As she grew older, nothing similar ever happened again. She doesn't remember the event, which isn't surprising since she was so young. It's simply one of those strange parenting memories that has stayed with me. Over the years, whenever people share stories about children seeing things adults can't, my mind always returns to that quiet night in the living room. I can still picture myself sitting on the sofa, gently rocking my daughter while the staircase stood behind me. I remember the sudden silence after all her crying stopped. I remember her bright smile. I remember her cheerful little hi, and I remember the strange feeling that washed over me when I turned around, fully expecting to see my husband standing there, only to find an empty staircase and a silent house, while my daughter continued happily waving at someone only she seemed able to see. For about 2 years, my family lived in a house that had been built sometime in the 1930s. It was one of those older homes with a lot of character. The floors creaked in certain places, the doors didn't always close perfectly, and every room had little quirks that newer houses just don't seem to have. People love telling stories about old houses being haunted, so whenever someone found out how old our home was, they'd usually ask if anything strange had ever happened there. Honestly, I always disappointed them. For almost the entire time we lived there, the house felt completely normal. There were no mysterious voices, no shadowy figures, no doors opening by themselves, no unexplained footsteps in the middle of the night. Nothing that ever made me think the house was anything other than an old building settling the way old buildings naturally do. That's actually why one particular incident has always stood out to me. It wasn't a series of strange events, it happened only once. But I've never come up with an explanation that completely satisfies me. At the time, my daughter was about a year old. Like most toddlers her age, she had a pretty reliable daily routine. Every afternoon she'd go down for a nap at almost the same time. Once she fell asleep, she'd usually stay asleep for quite a while. Those naps became the one predictable break in the middle of the day. On the afternoon this happened, everything was completely normal. I'd changed her, put her down in her crib, and turned on her sound machine like I always did. She slept better with white noise, so the little machine had become part of our regular routine. I also kept a baby monitor on, so I could keep an eye on her while I took care of things around the house. Once I was sure she was asleep, I quietly left the room and went about my day. The monitor showed exactly what I expected. She was lying peacefully in her crib. The room was quiet, except for the steady sound coming from the white noise machine. Nothing seemed unusual. A little while later, without any warning, I heard an incredibly loud crash coming from her bedroom. It wasn't a small bump or something lightly falling over. It sounded like an object had been thrown across the room. The noise was loud enough that I immediately stopped what I was doing. My first thought was that my daughter had somehow climbed up or grabbed something she shouldn't have. Even though she was still very young, parents learn to react instantly whenever they hear unexpected noises coming from a child's room. I hurried down the hallway and opened the bedroom door. The moment I stepped inside, something immediately caught my attention. The sound machine wasn't where I'd left it. Instead of sitting beside the crib, it was all the way across the room. It had somehow ended up on the floor after what sounded like a forceful impact. For a second, I just stood there trying to understand what I was looking at. The machine hadn't simply tipped over. It was much farther away than I would have expected if it had simply fallen off a nearby surface. Then I looked toward the crib. My daughter was still asleep, not stirring, not moving. She looked completely peaceful. At first, I assumed she must have been pretending. Parents know that toddlers sometimes hear you coming and quickly close their eyes, hoping you'll think they're still asleep. For a brief moment, I thought maybe she'd somehow reached the sound machine, knocked it across the room, and then immediately settled back down before I walked in. It seemed unlikely, but it was still the first explanation that came to mind. I quietly walked over to the crib. She didn't react. I watched her for a few moments. Her breathing was slow and steady. She looked deeply asleep. Still not completely convinced, I gently picked her up. She remained completely limp in that way only deeply sleeping toddlers do. She barely even responded. It became obvious almost immediately that she hadn't been pretending. She was genuinely asleep. In fact, she seemed so deeply asleep that I actually laughed a little. There was no way she had just staged the whole thing. She hadn't suddenly closed her eyes after making the noise. She'd clearly been asleep the entire time. That left me staring back at the sound machine. I walked over and picked it up. Nothing appeared broken. I checked the shelf, where it had originally been sitting. I tried imagining how it could have fallen naturally. Maybe vibrations had slowly moved it closer to the edge over time. Maybe it had simply tipped off. Those possibilities certainly seemed reasonable. The only part I couldn't fully explain was how far away it had landed. It seemed to have traveled farther than I expected. Still, I know objects can bounce or slide in surprising ways depending on the floor and the angle of the fall. Old houses also shift and settle. Furniture isn't always perfectly level. There are plenty of ordinary explanations that are worth considering. After checking everything, I simply placed the sound machine back where it belonged and let my daughter finish her nap. Nothing else happened that day. In fact, nothing unusual happened again for the rest of the time we lived there. We stayed in that house until my daughter was around 2.5 years old. Eventually, our family moved to Florida. Life moved on. Years later, I eventually relocated back to Seattle. By then, my daughter was old enough to remember parts of her early childhood. One thing that has always surprised me is how much she loved that old house. Whenever it comes up in conversation, she talks about it with genuine affection. She remembers it as a happy place. She has nothing but good memories of living there. She certainly doesn't remember the afternoon when I walked into her room after hearing that loud crash. She was far too young. To her, it was simply the house where she spent her earliest years. Whenever people ask whether anything strange ever happened in that old 1930s house, that's the only story I have. Considering its age, I'm honestly surprised that's all there was. For 2 full years, everything else about the house felt completely ordinary. No repeated incidents, no eerie experiences, no unexplained sounds in the middle of the night. Just one unusually loud crash during an afternoon nap, a sound machine that somehow ended up across the room, and a 1-year-old who slept peacefully through the entire thing without waking up. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation that I simply never figured out. Maybe the sound machine fell in exactly the right way and bounced farther than I realized. That's entirely possible. But every now and then, I still think back to that afternoon. I remember rushing into the room expecting to find an awake toddler causing trouble, only to discover my daughter sleeping so deeply that even picking her up barely woke her. Then I'd look over at the sound machine sitting across the room and wonder, just for a moment, what really caused that loud crash while everyone else in the house was completely asleep. I grew up in a very rural area in Maine, and when I was in high school, I used to sneak out at night to visit my girlfriend. She lived a little less than a mile away from my grandmother's house, and I would quietly run over there, spend some time with her, then bring her back before the sun came up. There was one detail about those nights that matters. My girlfriend was blind. Because of that, when we walked or ran together, we always held hands. She relied on her other senses a lot more than most people, especially her hearing. At the time, I didn't think much about it. It was just our normal routine. The road between our houses was quiet and isolated. It was the kind of place where there were almost no streetlights, very few cars, and long stretches of woods on both sides. During the day, it was peaceful. At night, it felt completely different. The darkness seemed much heavier when you were alone out there. One night, while I was running toward my girlfriend's house, I noticed something strange along the side of the road. There was a patch of tall grass nearby. Not just regular grass, either. It was at least 2 feet tall, maybe more. What caught my attention was that the grass looked like something had pushed it down. A path had been flattened through it. The blades were bent over and pressed in one direction, almost like something had been dragged through there. What really bothered me was the color. It looked like there were dark stains across the flattened area. My first thought was that it was probably blood. I immediately tried to explain it logically. Maybe a coyote had caught something and dragged it into the grass. That kind of thing happens in rural areas. Animals hunt. They leave remains. Nature can look disturbing if you come across it unexpectedly. I told myself that was all it was. But even after I kept running, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was something about that spot that made me uncomfortable. I didn't stop to investigate. I just kept going. About an hour later, I was running back with my girlfriend. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. We were holding hands as usual, moving along the road in the darkness. Then suddenly she stopped. Completely, I looked at her, confused. She told me to stop too. I asked what was wrong. She said she heard someone humming. At first, I thought she was joking. There was nobody around. No houses nearby, no cars, no lights, just the road and the woods. I listened carefully. I couldn't hear anything. But she was certain. She said someone was humming somewhere off to our left. The exact direction she pointed was almost the same area where I'd seen the flattened grass earlier. That instantly made me uneasy. She kept saying she could hear it, not just a random sound, a person humming. I stood there trying to listen. The silence around us felt strange. I couldn't hear what she was hearing, but I trusted her senses. She had always been much better at noticing sounds than I was. For about 30 seconds, we just stood there in the middle of the road. Then I decided we needed to leave. I didn't know what was out there. I didn't know if it was an animal, a person, or something completely harmless. But standing still in the dark near that spot felt like a terrible idea. I told her we needed to keep moving. Then I started running. I got her back home safely. Before I left, I promised I would text her when I got back to my grandmother's house. Then I turned around and started the run back. Normally, that run was easy for me. I was an all-state runner in high school. I was in excellent shape. A mile was nothing. I could run that distance without thinking about it. But that night was different. I have never run that hard before, and I haven't run that hard since. I kept thinking about the grass, the humming, the fact that she heard something I couldn't. I tried telling myself there was a normal explanation. Maybe someone was outside. Maybe an animal was making a strange noise. Maybe my mind was just working overtime because of what I'd already seen. Those thoughts didn't help much. As I got closer to the flattened grass, I started slowing down slightly. I was trying to see into the darkness. That's when I noticed something. 2 small points of light. They were sitting off to the side of the road. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at. They were bright, almost like tiny red dots. My entire body immediately reacted. I didn't stop. I didn't investigate. I just started running faster. I moved as far away from those points as I could while still staying on the road. As I got closer, I could finally make out a shape. Something was sitting there. It was hunched over. The way it was positioned reminded me almost of a large animal sitting upright, similar to the way a panda might sit. It was on its back legs, with its body resting downward. I was still trying to understand what I was seeing when I passed closer. Then it moved. Its head turned toward me. That's when everything clicked. Those red points weren't reflections. They were eyes. And the thing sitting there wasn't a coyote. It looked strangely human. The closest description I can give is that it looked like a small person sitting there. The size and shape reminded me of a child. But something about it was completely wrong. The face, the expression, the grin. It didn't look like anything I recognized. The moment I saw it turn toward me, I felt pure panic. I didn't stop running. I didn't look back. I just ran. I ran harder than I thought I physically could. The fear gave me a burst of energy I didn't know I had. The last half-mile back felt like it disappeared. Later, when I looked at the time, I realized I had covered that distance unbelievably fast. I barely remember reaching the house. I just remember getting inside. My grandmother found me in the mudroom. I was shaking. I was covered in mud. I was clearly terrified. She asked what happened. I didn't know how to explain it. I knew saying, "I saw something sitting by the road with red eyes," and a strange grin would sound ridiculous. So I gave her a simpler explanation. I told her I needed to clear my head and went out for a late-night run. Then saw something that scared me. She assumed it was probably a coyote. She told me I was fine and sent me to bed. I didn't argue. I didn't know what else to say. The next day, I wanted to prove to myself that I had just misunderstood what happened. My grandmother drove with me back to that area. We went to the spot near the grass. The flattened area was still there. The grass was still pushed down, and the dark staining was still visible. It looked exactly like I remembered. I never found a clear explanation for it. I've spent years trying to think of ordinary possibilities. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe fear and darkness made me misinterpret what I saw. Maybe my brain filled in details after hearing the humming and seeing the eyes. Those are all possible. I don't consider myself someone who believes in monsters or paranormal stories. I've always been pretty skeptical. But that night was different. Something happened out there that I still can't explain. The strangest part isn't even what I saw. It's that my girlfriend heard the humming before I saw anything. She noticed something was there while I didn't. And when I finally passed that spot, there really was something sitting there. To this day, I don't know what it was. I only know that I've never experienced fear like that before. Even now, years later, I occasionally dream about that night. I'll wake up suddenly, covered in sweat, remembering the road, the darkness, and those two red points, watching from the side. Maybe there was a completely normal explanation. Maybe someday I'll hear one that makes sense. But until then, that night in rural Maine remains the one experience I can't fully explain. I have two strange experiences that have stayed with me for years. The first one involves something I later learned people call the Hat Man. The weird part is that when it happened, the internet wasn't really a thing yet, and I had no idea other people had reported seeing something similar. I was around 12 years old in the mid-1990s. My best friend and I were spending time in the basement of our church. The basement was also used as a daycare area, so there were several rooms down there filled with toys and kid-related stuff. We were just hanging out and messing around like kids do. The main room where we were had a smaller nursery room connected to it. That nursery room had two separate entrances from the main area and a window facing into it. Because of the layout, there was really no way for someone to enter or leave that room without us noticing. The basement was quiet. There weren't many people around. We were just doing our own thing when suddenly something caught my attention. I looked toward the nursery window. For a brief moment, I saw a man walking past. He was wearing a hat. It happened quickly. Just a person moving by the window. At first, I didn't think too much about it. I assumed someone had come downstairs. Maybe a parent, maybe a worker, maybe someone checking on the daycare area. But something about it felt strange. I turned to my friend and asked, "Did you see that?" Without hesitation, he answered, "The man in the hat?" That immediately made me freeze. I wasn't expecting him to describe the exact same thing I had seen. I said, "Yeah," we both realized we had noticed the same person. Naturally, our first thought was that someone was trying to scare us. Maybe another kid. Maybe an older person playing a prank. So instead of just sitting there wondering, we decided to investigate. We figured we'd go into the nursery room from both entrances and catch whoever was hiding in there. Since there were two doors, we thought we'd have them trapped. My friend went one way. I went the other. We entered the room. And there was nobody there. Not hiding, not standing near the window, not anywhere. The room was completely empty. We checked around because we were convinced there had to be an explanation. But there wasn't. The window hadn't been opened. Nobody had walked out. There wasn't anywhere someone could have gone without us seeing them. That was enough for us. We didn't stick around trying to figure it out. We left. Quickly, years passed. I eventually forgot about the whole thing. It became one of those weird childhood memories that you occasionally think about but never really talk about. Then, years later, I came across a YouTube video discussing something called the Hat Man phenomenon. I had never heard of it before. The video talked about people reporting seeing a tall, shadowy figure wearing a hat. When I watched it, I was honestly shocked. The description sounded incredibly similar to what my friend and I had experienced as kids. The thing that surprised me most was that people from completely different places had reported seeing something with similar details. I immediately messaged my old friend. I told him I had found something online and asked if he remembered what happened in the church basement. He remembered, and when I explained the Hat Man stories, he was just as surprised as I was. Neither of us had known there was a name for anything like that. We had never discussed it with anyone else. It was just this strange moment from our childhood that we both remembered. The second strange thing I saw was completely different. It wasn't a shadow figure. It wasn't something unexplained in a building. It was something I witnessed outside during a storm. This one happened in the late 1990s. I was sitting in a car with my mom and my cousin. We were stopped at a red light at an intersection during a storm. The weather was already intense. The sky was dark. The rain and wind made everything feel dramatic. Then we noticed something unusual. There was a large glowing orb in the sky. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. It looked like a ball of light. It wasn't a normal lightning strike. It wasn't a streetlight reflection. It was a bright, pulsating orb that seemed to be floating. All three of us noticed it. The strangest part was that it wasn't just a flash. It stayed there. It appeared to move slowly. The orb began descending toward a tree across the street from us. We just sat there watching. Nobody really knew what to say. It looked impossible. The light continued moving downward until it reached the tree. The second it touched the tree, everything changed. There was a loud explosion. The tree suddenly broke apart. The trunk caught fire. The entire thing happened so quickly that it almost didn't feel real. We were just sitting there at a traffic light, and seconds later, we had witnessed something that looked like it belonged in a movie. Afterward, I learned about something called ball lightning. It is a rare weather phenomenon where glowing spheres of light have been reported during storms. I don't know if that's exactly what we saw, but it seems like the closest explanation. I've searched for videos and stories about similar events, and while there are reports of strange glowing orbs during storms, I've never found anything that perfectly matches what we witnessed that night. That moment has stayed with me because it was so vivid. The glowing sphere, the way it moved, the way it hit the tree, the explosion, the fire. It was one of the most incredible things I've ever seen. Looking back, both experiences are interesting for completely different reasons. The Hat Man incident is strange because my friend and I saw the same thing before we had ever heard of anyone else describing it. The ball lightning experience is strange because it was a real event we watched happen right in front of us, even if the exact explanation remains uncertain. I don't claim either story proves anything supernatural. There may be explanations for both, but they are two moments from my life that I will probably never forget. Sometimes you experience something so unusual that even years later, you can still picture every detail. And these are two of those moments for me. When I first moved into this house, I thought I had found an amazing deal. The place was older, but it was charming. It sat away from the other houses on a hillside surrounded by trees, which gave it a quiet and private feeling. It wasn't one of those crowded neighborhoods where every house looked the same. The rent was only $700 a month, which felt almost too good to pass up. The only downside was that the house had been sitting empty for a while. Nobody had lived there recently, so it needed some work before I could move in. It was dusty. It was dirty. There were signs that the place had been untouched for quite some time. Nothing unusual for an empty older house. I figured I'd spend a few days cleaning, then move my things in. One day while I was cleaning, I brought my nephew with me. He was about 10 years old at the time. He wasn't interested in helping clean, which was understandable for a kid, so he spent most of his time outside on the porch playing while I worked inside. Everything started out completely normal. I was moving around the house, wiping things down, getting rid of dust, and trying to make the place feel like home. Then, without warning, something changed. I got this overwhelming feeling of dread. It came out of nowhere. There was no sound. Nothing happened. There was no obvious reason for me to feel that way. But suddenly, I felt terrified. Not just uncomfortable. Not just uneasy. It was intense. The kind of fear that makes your body react before your brain can understand why. It felt almost like a panic attack. My heart started racing. My entire body felt like it was telling me something was wrong. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just tired. Maybe I was stressed from moving. Maybe the unfamiliar house was getting to me. Older houses can feel strange when you're alone in them. They creak. They make noises. The lighting can be weird. There are plenty of normal reasons a place can feel uncomfortable. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Then one thought suddenly hit me. My nephew. For some reason, my mind immediately went to him. I became convinced something had happened outside. Maybe he'd fallen. Maybe he was hurt. I didn't stop to think about it. I just reacted. I ran. Actually ran through the house and outside as fast as I could. When I got to the porch, I saw him. He was there, but he wasn't playing. He was crying, not just upset, completely terrified. He looked overwhelmed and scared. I immediately asked him what happened. He told me he heard screaming coming from inside the house. He said he didn't know what to do. He was scared to go inside. That stopped me. Because at that exact moment, I had been inside, feeling the same unexplained fear. I hadn't heard anything. I hadn't heard screaming. I didn't know what he had heard. But the timing was impossible to ignore. I had suddenly felt extreme panic for no clear reason. And when I ran outside thinking something was wrong with him, he was standing there terrified because he thought something was wrong inside the house. It was one of the strangest coincidences I've ever experienced. Years passed. My nephew grew up. He's 18 now. The weirdest part is that he doesn't even remember it happening. I've brought it up before, and he has no memory of that day. Nobody really believes me when I tell the story. I understand why. It sounds strange. A kid hearing screaming in an empty house. An adult suddenly feeling panic for no reason. Both happening at the same time. If someone told me that story, I'd probably wonder if there was another explanation too. But that moment stayed with me. And honestly, that wasn't even the only strange thing about that house. After I moved in, I started feeling uncomfortable there regularly. Not one single dramatic event, just a constant feeling that something was off. I had trouble sleeping. A lot. I would wake up at night feeling uneasy for no obvious reason. The house just never felt relaxing. There were times when I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. A quick shape. Something that looked like it moved past a doorway. Every time I'd turn to look, Nothing. At first, I tried to convince myself it was normal. Your peripheral vision is easily fooled, especially in low light, especially when you're tired. A passing car can create reflections. A change in shadows can look like movement. There are lots of ordinary explanations. But it happened often enough that it started bothering me. I'd also hear things, sounds from another room, small noises, things that made me pause and listen. Sometimes it sounded like someone moving around. I'd check. Nothing. The house would be completely quiet. The strangest part was how my cats acted there. Animals are usually just animals. They do weird things. They stare at walls. They react to sounds we don't notice. That happens. But in that house, they'd sometimes sit and stare into certain rooms for long periods, not just casually looking. They'd focus on one spot, like they were watching something. Again, there are normal explanations. Cats hear things humans can't. They notice tiny movements. They see things we miss, but combined with everything else, it added to the feeling I already had. The house never felt dangerous exactly. It just felt wrong. Like I was always waiting for something. I hated being there. The funny thing is, from the outside, it looked like the perfect place. It was peaceful. It was surrounded by trees. It had character. It was affordable. It should have felt cozy. Instead, I spent a lot of time feeling uncomfortable. I don't know what happened there. I don't know if there was anything unusual about the house itself. Maybe it was just an old building with strange noises and poor lighting. Maybe the isolation made everything feel more intense. Maybe my mind connected unrelated events because the first experience with my nephew was so memorable. Those explanations are possible. But I still remember that first day, standing inside the house, feeling that sudden wave of fear, not knowing why, then running outside and finding my nephew crying because he was afraid of something he said he heard inside. That was the moment I knew I didn't like the place. And even though I stayed there for a while, that house always felt like somewhere I was only visiting. I wouldn't really say that I saw something that night. It was more that I heard it and felt its presence while we were walking. I live in South Florida, and sometimes I like to go walking through the woods at night. I've always been a huge animal lover, and that includes insects and smaller creatures too. Exploring the woods and finding different animals is something I genuinely enjoy. So being out there in the middle of the night isn't really unusual for me. My ex-girlfriend at the time was also interested in herping, which is basically looking for different kinds of small animals, reptiles, amphibians, and insects. She came with me that night because we both enjoyed being out there and seeing what we could find. Living in Florida means you are almost always around wildlife. Sometimes it's harmless, but sometimes it's not. Most people know Florida is famous for alligators, but many don't realize we also have animals like bears, panthers, bobcats, and other predators roaming around. Because of that, I always make sure I'm prepared whenever I go into the woods. I carry flashlights, a first aid kit, and I usually have a small handgun with me. I'm not someone who goes looking for trouble, but when you're walking through remote areas at night, being careful just makes sense. That night, my ex and I were walking through the woods after sunset. The sun had gone down maybe 30 minutes earlier. We had actually been out there before dark looking for deer and wild hogs, but we stayed longer than planned and ended up deeper into the woods than we originally intended. At first, everything felt completely normal. We had our flashlights, we knew the area, and we weren't worried. I remember thinking that even though it was dark, we were fine because we had our lights and we could easily find our way back. But then her flashlight battery died. Not exactly the best timing, so now we had to share my flashlight. We stayed close together and started heading back toward the vehicle. At first, nothing seemed different. It was just a normal walk back through the woods at night. Then I started feeling something. I can't really explain it, but it felt like we were being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct I had was telling me something wasn't right. I grew up hunting, so I'm used to being in the woods and paying attention to my surroundings. When you spend enough time outdoors, you learn to notice little things. We stopped walking. I stood there quietly and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual, just the normal sounds of the woods. Insects making noise, leaves moving slightly, the sounds you expect to hear at night. Nothing that seemed dangerous. After a moment, I convinced myself it was probably nothing, and we continued walking. A few minutes later, I heard something. There was movement behind us. It sounded like rustling in the vegetation, maybe about 30 feet away. Immediately, the feeling came back. That same uncomfortable sensation of knowing something was nearby. The hair on my neck stood up again. I turned around quickly and pointed the flashlight in the direction of the noise. Nothing. I searched the area as best as I could. I looked between the trees, checked the bushes, and scanned the shrubs around us. There was nothing there. No animal, no movement, nothing. But I knew I had heard something. At that point, I started believing that whatever was out there was watching us and was very good at staying hidden. It wasn't just a random noise anymore. Something felt wrong. I told my ex to walk a little faster. I didn't want us to run because running could make things worse, but I wanted to put more distance between us and whatever was out there. I told her to stay alert and keep close. The next few minutes felt strange. Time seemed to move differently. Every second felt stretched out, but at the same time, everything was happening so quickly. Then I heard it again. This time it was closer and louder. The sound of something moving through the brush behind us was much clearer than before. I immediately pulled my weapon out and turned around. Again, I saw nothing. I scanned the area with the flashlight, checking everything around us. Trees, bushes, shadows, anything that could hide an animal. Still nothing. But this time I knew I wasn't imagining it. I knew what I heard. I knew that feeling I had was real. I grabbed my ex and moved her behind me so I could stay between her and whatever was out there. We kept moving while I continued scanning the area. Luckily, we weren't too far from the vehicle anymore. Maybe half a mile away, give or take. At that point, I made a decision. I told her that when I counted to 3, we were going to run, not walk, not speed up. Run, I counted. 1, 2, 3, and we both took off. We ran as fast as we could through the woods, trying not to trip over roots or uneven ground. The flashlight bounced around as we moved, making it even harder to see clearly. And then that's when it happened. I heard it, clear as day. A loud growl, not a normal animal sound from far away. It sounded close, and it sounded like something large and aggressive. The best way I can describe it is like the sound a bobcat or panther might make. Right after that, I heard something crashing through the vegetation behind us. Palm fronds breaking, bushes being pushed aside, branches moving. Whatever it was coming after us. At that point, we didn't stop. We didn't look back. We just ran. The entire way to the vehicle felt like a blur. All I could think about was getting out of those woods. When we finally reached the car, we were rushing and fumbling to get the doors open. We jumped inside as quickly as possible and locked the doors behind us. The moment the doors closed, there was this mix of relief and disbelief. We were safe, but we were also shocked by what had just happened. I've had some pretty intense experiences in my life. I've swum with sharks that were the size of small cars. I've hand-fed alligators over 10 feet long. I've ridden motorcycles at speeds over 170 mph. None of those things scared me the way that night did. The worst part wasn't knowing there was an animal nearby. The worst part was feeling like we were being hunted while never actually seeing what was following us. There is something terrifying about knowing something is there, hearing it move around you, and realizing it knows exactly where you are while you have no idea where it is. That feeling is something I never want to experience again. To this day, I still think about that night whenever I'm in the woods after dark. I still love wildlife, and I still respect nature, but that experience reminded me that when you enter an animal's territory, you're not always the one in control. When I was around 8 or 9 years old, my family and I moved to North Carolina, into a house in Granite Falls. From the beginning, something about the place felt wrong. The house itself was strange, and even the whole street had an unsettling feeling. It was a cul-de-sac, and we quickly found out that the neighbors did not like us. The reason was because we had moved into a house where their friend or family member had been evicted. On top of that, we were from Michigan, and for some reason they held that against us. The situation became so bad that they would ride four-wheelers through our yard, damage it, and even walk past our house while threatening us with guns. It was a horrible environment to live in. The dogs in the neighborhood also acted strangely. They would bark at our house constantly, at all hours of the day and night. It got to the point where it felt like something was always happening around that house. Because of the aggressive neighbors and the constant barking dogs, my older sister, who was 12 years older than me, started staying awake at night and sleeping during the day. She wanted to keep watch and make sure nobody was messing with our house or trying to get inside. At the time, I did not know about a lot of the stranger things happening there. I think my dad and sister tried to keep it away from me because I was still a kid, and they probably didn't want to scare me or my mom. I only found out about some of those things after we moved away. My dad told us that one morning, while he was getting ready for church, he heard what sounded like chanting coming from the woods behind our house. We joked about it afterward, saying something like, "Great, now we have aggressive neighbors and possible cult members." But we never had any real proof that anyone was actually out there. My sister also experienced strange things. She said she would hear a child laughing and running through the house. The weird part was that I was the only child living there, and I was never running around or making noises like she described. Then I had my own experiences. The first one happened while I was in the dining room and kitchen area. I was playing with a small sandbox toy I had placed on the roof of my dollhouse. Everything seemed normal, but suddenly I got the feeling that I was being watched. I looked around the room and noticed my dad's Homer Simpson radio. The eyes on it, which were actually the dials, looked like they were facing toward me. It instantly creeped me out. I turned it around so it wasn't facing me anymore and went back to playing. But the feeling didn't go away. I still felt like something was watching me. After a while, I looked to my right toward the living room area. There were a couple of bay windows there, and in the farthest window, I saw the outline of a head, a person's head. I was terrified. My mom and sister were out getting pizza, so it was just me and my dad at home. I ran and told him what I saw, and he went to check. When he looked, nothing was there. Even now, I can't remember if the head was inside the house or outside the window, but I know one thing for sure: I saw a head. The experience that affected me the most happened later, and it is something I still struggle with remembering. It was the day we were moving back to Michigan. I woke up and realized the power had been turned off. I asked my sister what happened, and she told me that our parents had gone out to get the electricity transferred back over because we were leaving that day. She went back to sleep, and I decided to go into my parents' room. I laid on their bed and started playing my Ds. I remember exactly what game I was playing. It was Cartoon Network Racing, and I was on the Dexter's Laboratory map. Everything was normal until that same feeling came back. the feeling of being watched. I stopped playing and slowly looked up toward the doorway. That is when I saw it. There was a figure standing there. It looked like a person, but it wasn't normal. It was extremely tall, around 7 feet, and completely black. It almost looked like it was made of shadows, but I could still see different shades and details, like light and darkness moving across it. It was staring directly at me. The part I remember most was its face. One side of it looked damaged, almost like part of the face was missing, but still connected. It looked unnatural and terrifying. At the time, sunlight was coming through the skylight in the kitchen area, and the beams of light passed right through the figure. I remember staring at it, completely frozen. I don't even think I was breathing. That was the first time I truly understood what people meant when they said they were frozen in fear. After what felt like forever, the figure looked away from me and slowly moved to the right side of the doorway. I don't know how long I stayed there, but eventually I felt like I could breathe again. I wasn't frozen anymore. I got off the bed and remember praying that it would not still be there when I looked around the corner. Thankfully, it was gone. I immediately went to the dining room near the fireplace to check on our family rabbit, Kektielts. Her name was supposed to be Cuddles, but when I was 5 years old, I didn't know how to spell it properly. When I looked at her, she was pressed against the back of her cage, breathing heavily and shaking. She had seen it too. That made the whole thing even worse. After making sure she was okay, I ran to my sister's room and woke her up. I was crying and completely terrified. I told her what happened. She let me stay in her room and play my Ds at the foot of her bed until our parents came home. The last strange thing happened later that same day. My sister and I were moving boxes through the house and taking them outside to the moving truck. At one point, our parents weren't inside. That's when we heard something. It sounded like a man howling or calling out hello, but we knew nobody was inside the house. We checked, and my dad checked too. He looked through the house and around the outside, but there was no one there. That house was strange in so many ways. Between the threatening neighbors, the dogs that chased us, the strange sounds, and the things we experienced inside the house, it felt like something was very wrong there. Later, we found out the house had been struck by lightning multiple times. I know that could just be a coincidence, but after everything else that happened, it definitely added to the feeling that something was not right. Years later, I had another experience where I thought I saw something that looked similar to the shadow figure from that house. It happened in the home I live in now, and it triggered such a strong panic response that my sister, who had moved out years earlier, came to pick me up after our parents returned, because I didn't want to leave my dog alone in the house. Even now, those memories still affect me. I have had nightmares and panic attacks because of what happened there. Some people have accused me of making it up, but I know what I experienced. That house in Granite Falls was one of the strangest and most terrifying places I have ever lived. I've shared this story a few times before, but it's still one of the strangest things I experienced during my time working in a prison. I worked as a prison officer for more than a decade, and my final assignment was at a hospital outside of the prison system that had a dedicated area just for inmates. I worked the night shift there for around 5 years, and during that entire time, I only had 2 experiences that I would consider genuinely strange or unexplained. The hospital had a room setup that was unusual. There were 2 separate rooms placed back to back, sharing a wall. Over the years, staff started noticing something strange about those rooms. There was supposedly a kid that seemed to appear there, a little boy from what people described. The strange thing was that he usually seemed to show up when an inmate was close to death or when someone was in a severe mental state. Over the years, we had several inmates who were nearing the end of their lives mention seeing a child in their room. Some would talk to the child like it was someone they knew. They would say things like, "You've gotten so big," or "I've missed you." Or they would compare him to someone from their family. They acted as if they were seeing a grandchild. One time, a couple of coworkers who were working overtime on my shift told me about an elderly inmate who became extremely happy because he said he had seen his grandbaby. He was apparently upset because we wouldn't let the child's mother come in to visit, and it became a whole issue for him. The strange part was that it wasn't only inmates who were dying who mentioned the child. Every once in a while, someone would come into the hospital after taking some kind of drug and experiencing a serious mental episode, and they would also talk about the kid. At first, I always assumed there was a normal explanation. I'm an agnostic atheist, and I don't really believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. I figured the stories were probably just passed around by staff. Maybe someone had mentioned the child to inmates before, and the idea got stuck in their minds. A simple suggestion could make people imagine things. That was what I believed. Until I had my own experience. One night, I was assigned to those rooms, and we had a young inmate brought in. I think he was there because of K2 or some other substance. He was in his early 20s, maybe even younger, and he was completely out of it. He was deep into a drug-induced psychosis when he arrived. At first, he was loud, confused, and difficult to deal with, but eventually we got him settled. He was given medication, calmed down, and finally became quiet. Hours passed. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, he suddenly woke up and became agitated again. There wasn't much we could do except keep an eye on him, make sure he stayed safe, and let him talk through whatever he was experiencing. Before long, he started completely losing it. He began screaming about the kid. He said the kid was in his room, running around, bothering him, and keeping him awake. He was terrified and angry, yelling about this child that he claimed was messing with him. And that was the moment that really bothered me. Because it was my room, my inmate, my shift. The guy had come from a different prison unit a couple of hours away, and as far as I knew, he had never heard any stories about the child. The hospital staff didn't openly talk about it with inmates either. It was mostly something only the prison officers knew about, because we were the ones there every night. That was the part I couldn't explain. I still don't know what happened. Maybe he somehow picked up on something without me knowing. Maybe there was a psychological reason for it. Maybe it was just his mind reacting to the drugs and the environment. But experiencing it myself definitely made me question things. The second experience happened with an elderly inmate who was slowly dying. He was someone who came through the hospital regularly, and most of the staff strongly disliked him. His crimes were terrible, and after reading his records, it was easy to understand why people felt that way. By this point in my career, I had seen enough people near death that I started recognizing the signs. That night, it was obvious he was getting close. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. But his eyes were wide open and active, not the way someone looks when they are just staring blankly. His eyes were moving around like he was watching something above him, like something was on the ceiling. Every so often, he made a small sound, but it didn't sound like pain. It sounded like fear. 2 nurses and I stood there watching him, and honestly, it was one of the strangest moments of my life. This man was clearly terrified of something, but there was nothing we could see. There wasn't much we could do because he was already receiving comfort care. Eventually, he passed away. And then, almost immediately after, the sink turned on. The sink had definitely been off. Nobody had entered the room, and there was no obvious way for someone to have turned it on. The whole situation was already disturbing enough. Watching someone die while looking terrified at something invisible was unsettling, but then the sink turning on right afterward made the entire thing feel even stranger. I still don't claim it was a ghost. I'm still the same person. I don't believe in heaven, hell, or anything like that. But after everything I saw in that hospital, I do wonder sometimes if there's something we don't understand. Maybe there's some connection between things that we can't explain. People's minds do strange things when they're dying. The body shutting down can affect the brain in ways we don't fully understand. That's the explanation I usually come back to. But part of me also likes the idea that maybe, just maybe, something was there. I don't know what happened in those rooms. I just know I'll never forget it. This memory happened sometime in the middle of the 2000s, when I was around 6 or 7 years old. I am much older now, but there are certain memories from childhood that never really leave you. Some moments fade away over time, but others stay in your mind with so much detail that you can still picture everything exactly as it happened. This is one of those memories for me. Before I explain what happened, there is something important about the layout of my old house. My bedroom window and the backyard faced each other. From my room, I had a clear view toward the backyard area, and because of the way everything was positioned, the window reflection could sometimes make things look strange. As a child, I didn't really think about reflections or how glass could change what you see. I just knew what my eyes were showing me. One day I was playing with my brother like we normally did. It was just a regular childhood moment. Nothing felt unusual or scary at first. We were just doing what kids do, spending time together and not thinking about anything beyond having fun. Then I saw him. I still remember the moment because it happened so suddenly. I swear I saw a man who looked like what I would describe as a leprechaun, standing on the other side of the reflection in my window. That is the only way I can explain the image that I saw back then. I know it sounds strange, and even when I tell the story now, I understand why people might question it. But as a child, it felt completely real. The strange thing was that I knew he could not have actually been inside my room. My window had blinds covering it, and they blocked the view from inside. There was no obvious way someone could have been standing there without me knowing. I wasn't looking away or distracted. I saw what I saw. The image of him is still burned into my memory. I remember the side of his face more than anything else. He was a white man wearing green clothing. He had ginger hair, a bent nose, and a strange little smirk or smile on his face. There was something about his appearance that made me think of a leprechaun, even though he didn't look like some cartoon character. He looked like a normal person, just different in a way I couldn't explain. What scared me the most wasn't even his appearance, it was how normal he acted. He didn't stare at me. He didn't turn toward me. He didn't seem surprised that I was there watching him. He didn't do anything that would make someone think they were being seen. He simply walked by, almost like he was just another person walking down the street. That was the part that confused me the most. If someone sees something scary, they expect it to react in some way. They expect it to chase them, look at them, or do something unusual. But this man didn't do any of those things. He acted completely calm. He moved like he belonged there, like there was nothing strange about him being there at all. But to me, it felt wrong. The moment I saw him, I became extremely scared. I was only 6 or 7 years old, so I didn't have the ability to explain what was happening or think through different possibilities. I just knew that I had seen something that terrified me. The fear stayed with me even after the moment was over. It wasn't just a quick feeling that disappeared after a few seconds. I remember feeling uncomfortable and scared afterward, especially being alone in my room. Eventually, I became so afraid that I couldn't sleep by myself. I needed my dad to sleep in my childhood bedroom with me because I didn't want to be alone. For a child, needing a parent nearby after seeing something frightening is probably normal, but this fear felt different to me because the memory felt so real. When I told my family about what happened, nobody really believed it. They thought it was probably just my imagination. They assumed that because I was young, my mind had created something, or that I had misunderstood what I saw. And honestly, I understand why they thought that. Kids can imagine things. Kids can mistake shadows, reflections, and shapes for something else. A child's mind is still developing, and sometimes things can feel real even when there is another explanation. For a long time, my family continued believing that was all it was. Just a childhood imagination. Just a strange memory from when I was young. But the reason I still think about it is because of how clear it was. I don't remember every single thing from when I was 6 or 7 years old. There are many normal childhood moments that I have completely forgotten. But I remember this. I remember the way the person looked. I remember the green clothing. I remember the ginger hair. I remember the shape of his face and the bent nose. I remember the small smile or smirk. Most importantly, I remember the feeling I had. It wasn't like a dream. It wasn't like a random thought. It felt like I was actually seeing someone pass by. Over the years, I have tried to think of possible explanations. Maybe the reflection from the window created an illusion. Maybe there was something outside that I didn't understand. Maybe the angle of the glass, lighting, or shadows caused my brain to create a face from something else. There are many normal explanations that could make sense. But even knowing that, the memory still feels strange. One thing that stands out to me is that the man didn't seem scary in his actions. He wasn't acting like something trying to frighten me. He wasn't doing anything aggressive. He was just walking by. If anything, that made the experience even stranger because it felt like I had accidentally seen something I wasn't supposed to see. The fact that he ignored me is what made it stay in my mind. I have heard people talk about seeing strange things when they were children. Many people describe memories that others don't believe. Sometimes they are explained as dreams, imagination, or misunderstandings. Other times, people are left with a memory they can't fully explain. I don't know exactly what happened that day. Maybe it was just a child's imagination. Maybe there was something about the reflection that made my brain see a person where there wasn't one. Maybe there was another explanation that I would understand if I could go back and look at that moment as an adult. But I also know how real it felt to me. Even now, after all these years, I can still picture that side of his face. I can still remember him walking past without looking at me. I can still remember how quickly that normal childhood day turned into something that scared me enough to need my dad beside me at night. Most childhood memories disappear with time, but this one stayed. Whether it was a trick of the reflection, something my young mind created, or something I simply cannot explain, it became one of the strangest moments of my childhood. And even though everyone around me believed it was just imagination, the memory itself has always felt very real to me.